Good morning, everyone. I want to welcome all the listeners here to another installment of the Fletcher webinar series. Today's topic is going to be political broadcasting, which we thought would be a timely refresher for those of you now that we are going to be going into the political season. And I am very, very happy once again to be able to introduce Dan Kirkpatrick from my office, who has joined me on several of these webinars, but we have our special guest today, Bobby Baker from the FCC's political programming staff. And Bobby has just been so great and generous with his time, and his staff has as well, to make themselves available to the various state associations to answer questions and to make their office available. We were supposed to have Bobby's colleague Gary Schoenman on here with us today as well, but unfortunately Gary fell ill. So Bobby's going to be doing double duty here today, but he's got plenty of experience here, so I do not think we will fall short. I also want to take this opportunity to thank the Colorado Broadcasters Association to help put this together. The CBA has been doing a fantastic job, and with Justin Sasso at the helm, has really been doing a fantastic service for the Colorado broadcasters and the broadcasting industry in the state. And as you know, has arranged either for the CBA or with other associations to have these webinars available. I also want to mention that before we get started here is that we have many prior webinars available on YouTube. There's a Fletcher, and Hildreth YouTube page where you can look up a variety of different webinars on many different subjects, including license renewals, EEO, public inspection files, and the like, and the list goes on and on. And we really invite all of you to really take advantage of that, especially with us going into a renewal cycle. And then also, we're going to leave a little bit of time at the end. Altogether, our presentation is probably going to go a little over an hour, but we're going to leave a little time at the end to take questions. And depending on how your computer is laid out, there should be a space on your right where you can type in questions and send them to us. We'll read as many of those questions as we have time to near the end. We may also break as the presentation goes on to take a question here and there. So please feel free to ask questions. And then, and so some of the topics that we're going to be, subjects that we're going to be covering today, as listed here, is some of the basics, the lowest unit rate calculations, equal time, how the FCC's political broadcasting rules interact with streaming and some of the content that you may be putting online, as well as we may be handling issue ads from political action committees, record keeping, which is going to be important, especially again mentioning that we're slowly getting into a FCC license renewal cycle, which for Colorado is going to be coming up over the next couple of years, and a variety of other subjects as well. But before we get really into the weeds here, I wanted to sort of turn it over to Bobby to maybe talk a little bit about his office and what they do, and give us sort of a primer into going into our topics here today. So Bobby?
Yes. My brain's alive now. Are we on camera now?
Yes.
Oh, we are. Okay. I've probably given this spiel many times, and a lot of you who have been in broadcasting for a while will not be surprised at what I'm going to say, but it's important. And that is that when I began many years ago, several decades, ago in political programming. I worked in a regime where enforcement was sort of the byword of the way we operated. So when people contacted us in those days, those early days, there was no email, but however they contacted us, typically by phone, the leadership then desired that they provide us with formal complaints, something in writing, so that we could respond in writing. And there was very little, almost no, informal interaction with people at your stations like you and anyone else that we dealt with. And as a result of that, and I witnessed it, so it developed my philosophy about what we should be doing. We would have, in many election periods, certainly in presidential election periods, we could have as many as 100 formal complaints that we needed to resolve and write orders for. And so in probably half the situations that we dealt with that way, the orders, because they had to go through the bureaucracy, weren't on the street until after elections had occurred. So they served no one in the public any good. Certainly the operatives in the political world found it completely unsatisfactory. And for you guys, because they were formal complaints, and typically you'd have to hire counsel to assist you with those scenarios, it was very costly for you, time intensive for the smaller market stations and smallly populated stations. That meant a lot of wasted time dealing with this extraneous interference with your life. As a result of that, and in a very short order, from the time that I was given the go-ahead to do it in a completely different way, which was instead of trying to make things percolate into something that was formal, I could help people work themselves out of situations. And if they could be worked out in short order, that was the end of it. We would not keep records of stations that we had assisted in that way. And it made for a much better universe for you, and certainly for all of the people that you deal with. The proof's in the pudding. We've had probably in my entire career as the leader of this group, we've had probably less than 75 formal complaints that we've resolved. So in 25, 26 years, rather than have those a multitude of times in that entire span, we've had as many as we used to have in a single year. So it's worked. I know that it's something that makes life much more pleasant for you, and it certainly makes life much more pleasant for us, because not only was it time intensive for you, but we had the same dilemma. And so we used to have, at one point when I began, there were 15 of us, 15 lawyers, including Milt Gross, who was my predecessor. So 16 in total in the very beginning. And ultimately things started to peel away, and the Fairness Doctrine was repealed in 1987. That certainly led to some diminution of the stuff that we had in front of us. But at the moment, it's really just Gary Schoenman and myself. We get assist from a number of other attorneys in the building when it's necessary. But it's a rare occurrence that we need to get people to help us with some paperwork and doing an investigation here or there. And again, those are very rare. So my word of advice at the beginning of this, because I remember in the early days when I used to read these regulations and speak them, they all sounded incredibly arcane and ambiguous. And it's certainly much of the regulation still fits into that mold. So I encourage people, when they have a head scratcher or they want some guidance, all they have to do is call us. And my direct number at the FCC is 202-418-1417. Gary's direct number is 418-1795. And Gary doesn't freely give his cell phone number, so I won't do it for him, but I'll give you mine. And that's something as I'm sure many of you are well aware of in your own lives. My phone, like this thing right here, is with me all the time, unfortunately. So I can be reached, and I will take calls even on weekends and sometimes when I'm walking along the beach. So you can reach me on that phone at 202-253-8419. So please take advantage of that, and hopefully I can lend some anecdotal information to the slides that you're about to witness, and I wish you good luck.
Thank you very much, Bobby. Let me just echo, just say, Bobby and Gary and their group have and I'm sure this is going to get me in trouble with other departments at the FCC, but they, without a doubt, make themselves more available, more helpful to broadcasters than just anyone else that I've dealt with at the FCC. I mean, they just go above and beyond the call of duty. And they always have, including, agreeing to participate in these webinars like this. So your efforts are very much appreciated. So let's dive into some of the subjects here, and I'm going to invite Bobby to chime in, and Dan's going to cover a few topics as well. And so where do we start? We're starting really with you being approached by a candidate, and what is a candidate? You want to be looking at where these rules get triggered is where you have someone who is a legally qualified candidate, and there's a variety of indicia to that. They have to have announced that they're going to run. They have to be qualified under state law to be able to hold office. They have to be qualified to be on the ballot. For presidential candidates, they have to be qualified in the state or in 10 states that they're running. And if you have any questions or doubts about that, good idea to check with your governmental official. I'll give you sort of a little anecdote. Years ago, many years ago, as a younger lawyer, was at a firm that was contacted by the Lyndon LaRouche campaign because they wanted to, I believe in that instance, they wanted to have buy time on a station and have access to the lowest unit rates and all that. And they had us research that. It turns out that Lyndon LaRouche was literally behind bars, serving time in jail at the time. And it turned out that in that state, he could not be on the ballot while he was serving in prison in that state. So we concluded that he could not be a legally qualified candidate. So, it's a good idea to check on what the rules are in that state. Then once you have your candidate, the question is there a use? Because that's also sort of a triggering event here. And a use does not have to be the purchase of political time. Some of the classic examples have always been sort of the Ronald Reagan movies that were put on the air. But it can include, if it's a candidate's appearance that is identifiable with, and on the radio, if it's identifiable with voice, or obviously on television with a picture, and if it's a positive appearance, that can be a use. Another classic example that I've run into here are situations where you have an on-air personality at a radio station that decides that they want to run for public office in the community. And in those situations now, as long as that person, if they become a legally qualified candidate, and if they're on the air, suddenly, that time that they're on the air could very well qualify as a use, and that triggers other obligations on the part of the stations, including equal time obligations that we'll get into in a moment here. So even if it's not controlled by the candidate, like a movie, that sort of thing, it can still be a use. So frequently, if we have situations, for example, if a DJ decides that they want to run for mayor of this city, we tell them you may want to take them off the air, because otherwise you could be triggering equal time obligations on the part of other people running for.
And I would also just add that the definition of positive use, positive is very broad. It's really anything that is not negative, like an attack ad does not qualify as positive. But I've seen this with like the Arnold Schwarzenegger. If he was running for office and the Terminator came on, he may have been the villain in that movie, but it's still a positive use.
That's true. That's right. Absolutely.
It's essentially anything that is not attacking him or reflecting very negatively on them would qualify as positive.
Right. So now, hearing all this, your head's maybe exploding. Oh my God, does that, because all the times that we've covered candidates in news programs, like what's going on. So So there are exemptions here, and they focus a lot around bona fide newscasts. If you're covering a presidential or a candidate debate, if you have a candidate on a news interview program, documentary, those can be exempt. And interestingly enough, we had an instance come up several years ago where I can't remember who the candidate was. Was it Donald Trump who was on the Howard Stern show? And so the question came up, and it being the Howard Stern shows when Howard Stern before XM Sirius when he was on terrestrial radio, whether this was a bona fide news show. And the commission held that given the dynamic of the interview, the questions that were being asked and the like, that it satisfies the requirements of a bona fide newscast. So it doesn't necessarily have to be, a news program. It can be an entertainment program, but can have aspects to it that are that are exempt because they constitute a bona fide newscast.
It does, however, have to include some actual interview,
right?
Interview aspects. Like it can't basically just be the announcer on the station saying, hi, I understand you're running for office. Tell us about yourself, and then giving him 30 minutes to just talk. That would not qualify as an interview. So there have to actually be questions.
Right. We had another instance where a station had they were going to have a candidate come on the air and pick their favorite songs and play DJ and then play the songs on the air. And they were like, well, but maybe intermittently say a couple of policy issues. And they're like, well, doesn't that qualify? We're like, it sounds kind of more entertainment to me. It sounds like kind of a positive use to convey a positive image for this candidate. So we were not quite as comfortable as giving that type of dynamic an exemption pass. Before we move on, I'm going to throw it over to Dan to talk about candidate access. Bobby, do you have any thoughts on
So what you just talked about?
Yeah, what I just talked about.
Well, I mean, I've had so many different experiences, but one that comes to mind in terms of the legally qualified candidate slide that you showed. I dealt personally with a candidate who was running out of the south, I guess it was the southwestern corner of Missouri. His name was Fraser Glenn Miller, at least that was his name at that moment in time. And he was running as a write-in candidate, but he was running for the U.S. Senate in the state of Missouri. So under our regulations, when you announce that you're doing write-in, not going for ballot certification, you need to make a substantial showing. You have to prove that you've been a candidate throughout the territory that you're running in. And so if you're running for a statewide office like the U.S. Senate in Missouri, you'd have to show that you were all over the state, which he was unable to do. He was only basically preaching to the choir down in that particular corner of Missouri. And in any event, when I called him to tell him, because we didn't make a formal thing out of it, to tell him personally that he just hadn't made the cut with us, his personality changed pretty dramatically to the point where it really got spooky. I felt like I was in an Exorcist movie, the way his voice went down about 3 octaves. And I had to get him on a do not enter list because he threatened me severely. And that's the same guy.
Wow.
And I had a hard time getting the security people to buy into the fact that I'd been threatened. And I said, you just don't have any idea who you're dealing with. And lo and behold, several years after that, that very same person walked into or outside of a assisted living place in Kansas. And because it had a Jewish name on as the building name for that, he just assumed that anybody and everybody that was around there would be Jewish. And so he killed, and it was one of the most awful killing, when he killed a grandfather who was with his grandson. They were visiting a relative that was in the facility. And I was trying to imagine what it would be like when his daughter got the call, because he was the grandfather or the father of the mother of this kid. So she found out that her son and her father had been killed. So that was the kind of guy I was dealing with. Fortunately, in my experience, I deal with some pretty wacky situations on occasion, but that certainly is the one that was the most extreme. But that points out, actually, just by the anecdotal information, that if you're dealing with somebody that claims to be entitled and they're running under the banner of being a write-in candidate, they do need to make a showing, which would be, having campaign headquarters, traveling around the state, giving speeches, having campaign literature and those kinds of things. Now that's becoming, I think, more complicated, although we've not had to rule on it yet. But in this modern era, the 21st century, there's a lot of social media being used. The sitting president of the United States used it in many ways. He uses it now in his policymaking. So that may become something that when you're dealing with somebody and they claim that they've got a website, that they're getting all kinds of attention, they've got 40,000 followers, that kind of thing. That'll be another day for us. But at the moment, as yet, that's not been a conclusive showing of being a write-in candidate.
Oh, wow, that's quite a story. Dan, you want to walk us through some of the standards for candidate access?
Sure. Once somebody has qualified as a candidate, there's two different standards that apply. For candidates for federal office, for president, Senate, Congress, they have what are called reasonable access rights, which we'll talk a little bit more about on the next couple of slides. But it basically means that if they are coming to you to try and buy ad time that would qualify as a use, that you have to sell it to them. At least you have to make it reasonably available to them. For state and local candidates, you do not need to grant access to any particular state or local race. Like if there's someone running for town council, you don't have to give any of the candidates access to the station's facilities or sell them time for town council. But if you sell time to any of the candidates for that race, you have to make it available to all of them. You can't sort of pick and choose and only allow one side on a race to buy time on the station. But you can say you're not selling it at all. Reasonable access for federal candidates, as I just mentioned, it applies only to candidate uses, as we talked about on the previous slides, but it applies during the entire campaign period. This is different from the lowest unit charge, for which there's a specified window. The reasonable access rules apply anytime after the person has met all of the qualifications to be a candidate. So it's after after they have basically announced that they're running. If it has not gotten to the point where they can get on a ballot, they don't have to have met that standard. You could be in that pre-ballot period as long as they have declared their candidacy and that they are running for this office. Reasonable access is what you have to give them. You don't have to give them access to anything and everything that they request, but some of the things you can't do. You can't set a flat limit on the amount or type of the time that the candidate can buy. You can't say, I'm only going to sell you 30-second spots. I'm not going to sell you anything, any 60-second spots or things like that. You can reject unreasonable requests if a candidate comes in and says, I want to buy, a full day's worth of time. That's probably going to be unreasonable. As a general rule, if a candidate makes a request that you think is unreasonable, you talk to them, try and negotiate with them, see what it is that they actually really want, and try and find something that will satisfy them. You also don't need to respond to blind requests. If if the request comes in and it hasn't identified themselves as a candidate, or they're just calling and saying, hey, what time do you have? What time can you sell me? You don't have to. You can wait and try and make them say, what do you want to buy? Are you looking for a 30-second spot? Do you want to buy it? What are you trying to buy from me? That's the kind of thing that you have to respond to and grant them access. Here's a few additional rules. You can't exclude any sort of time windows. You can't say, no, I won't sell primetime ads or in any particular programs, with the exception that you can exclude political advertising from your news programming. which a lot of stations may want to do. They don't want to get it confused as to, whether it's news coverage, whether it's advertising. You just exclude it entirely from the news programming, but not from any other category of programs. The candidates do not have the right to access any particular program. They can't say, I only want to buy time during the Super Bowl or during any other particular program that you have on. They can say, I want to buy time, during the evenings, during the 7 o'clock, during the 7 o'clock hour, but not a particular program necessarily. Also note that non-commercial stations are exempt from these reasonable access concerns. The non-commercial stations can't take political advertising anyway, so they obviously can't be required to accept political advertising. Reasonable determinations. Once a candidate has made this request, which I will also add, has to come from the candidate or their campaign committee. A third party cannot be coming in and demanding equal access, sorry, not equal access, reasonable access to the facilities. It has to be coming from the candidate or his authorized campaign committee. In determining whether what the candidate is asking for is reasonable, there's a broad range of things you can consider. Some of them are here. Things like, how much time have you previously sold to this candidate? How disruptive is this going to be on your programming? If they're coming in and saying, I want to buy 30 minutes in prime time, and that's going to require you to drop, significant valuable programming from your schedule, that's something that you can consider. You also can consider the possibility of what equal opportunity requests are going to do. We'll talk about this on the next couple of slides, but once you have sold time to one candidate for a race, you have to, upon request, make essentially equivalent time available to the other candidates in that race. So if you have, say it's the Democratic presidential primary and you have 10 candidates running, if one of them comes in and says, I want to buy 30 minutes of time on your station, you can reasonably consider the fact that that could ultimately require you to sell another 30 minutes to all of the other 9 candidates for that race. And that's something you can consider in terms of whether that first 30-minute request is reasonable. And then again, the timing of the request. If they come in, the day before an election and say, I need to buy an hour of time tomorrow, that may not be reasonable, or how much lead time they're giving you to try and schedule the advertising. It's also something you can consider. Do you have any thoughts, Bobby, on reasonable?
The only thing just to clarify for people, they don't have the right to get any specific programming, but by the same token, except for the news, the broadcaster can't exclude them from programs in their entirety. So if they ask for a particular program in prime time on television or in drive time on radio, you can't exclude that out of hand, but you can counteroffer different things. If they ask for a particular primetime program, you can offer them a different one on television. If they want to be in the 6 to 7 a.m. part of drive time, you can offer them 8 to 9 or 9 to 10, depending on how it's working in your particular jurisdiction. I can't sometimes get my numbers screwed up. So there's a lot of give and take on that. You just can't have bans against them getting into any particular programming, except for news programming, which you don't have to sell them at all. And as it was just indicated, you can keep them out of news if you think that that's the prudent thing to do. If you want, and a lot of broadcasters do this, if they want to keep candidates out of the hard news, they'll sell during, say, the sports or weather forecasting parts, where I guess, it puzzles me why people would think the public would be confused. But there were occasions, and this is like another example of how things sometimes, our policies can get screwed up. There was a candidate in Chicago probably 40 years ago. And what he did is he got actors who looked a great deal like the anchor people on a particular station in Chicago. And he put on like a mock 30 or 60-second newscast, so to speak. At least it would look like one. So in that case, there was a legitimate reason for thinking that people could get confused. Why it's still on the books at this juncture, I guess sometimes things that are created in a bureaucracy are easier to get created than they are to get rid of. And so the example of why it would be confusing is something that you guys may never see in your whole careers, but it is on the book. So, but I did want to make it clear that because you don't have to sell them a particular program, it doesn't mean that you can just exclude them from that program for the whole breadth of their campaign period.
Thanks, Bobby. State and local candidates, the stations have a lot more discretion as to what they can do with candidates for state and local races. As I said before, you can exclude the entire race. You can exclude all candidates for a race from being able to buy time on the station. And you can do that for some races and not others. You can do it for, city council, but, not for the governor's race. There's any number of things you can do there. You can also limit the number of ads or programs that you're going to sell. You can say, I'm only going to sell ads for the governor's race during, the 5 to 10 p.m. window. I'm not going to sell them at other times. You can restrict to certain day parts, to specific programs. Although I will say within that, the main thing to remember is that the equal opportunities rules will always apply. Once you have sold it to one candidate, you have to sell it to every other candidate in that race. And you can't apply these restrictions differently to different candidates. You can't say I'm going to allow the Republican candidate to buy time during the news, but not the Democratic candidate. That's clearly unacceptable. Once you've given something to one, you have to give it to all others. And you also have to make all discount classes of your advertising available. The lowest unit charge, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, applies to state, local, municipal, every kind of candidate who's buying time on the station during the lowest unit window. It applies. And then the no censorship rules also apply, which provide that if a candidate or their committee is buying ad time on your station, you cannot censor that ad. With the state and local candidates, you can say that you're not going to take any more advertising in that race, but you can't censor the ads that are given to you if you have agreed to take advertising. Equal opportunities, we've mentioned a couple of times. Again, this applies when a candidate becomes legally qualified. It applies to candidates in the same race, obviously those who are seeking the same office. And a candidate to qualify for equal opportunities has to make its request within 7 days of the opponent's initial non-exempt use of the station's facilities. There's a little bit of that 7 days could be extended in the event that you are not up to date on your political file obligations. If you sell ad time to one candidate, but you don't put the documents into your public file for a week after that, there may be some extension of that 7 days. You can't, avoid the equal opportunities rules by not providing notice in the public file that you have sold the time to the first candidate.
And Dan, just to kind of, so the equal opportunities requirements, as well as the lowest unit rate requirements, which I'm going to talk about in a moment here, just we're focusing on over-the-air ads. If a broadcaster that's listening today also has a web page and they sell, a commercial to ad for a campaign on their web page, the equal opportunities and the lowest unit rate provisions, they don't apply there, do they?
They don't. The one place where it may apply is if the station is selling ad time and saying, if you buy 10, 30-second spots for this particular rate, I will also throw in 15 free, internet spots. That may that may factor into the calculation of the lowest unit charge and what what you have to give that candidate if you're giving them away. But if somebody is just coming in and saying, I want to buy ad time on your website, that's not going to trigger any of these requirements or obligations. That's not going to come into play at all.
The only thing I'd add to that is the fact that under no circumstances would the FCC mandate that you sell those presences on your internet, your website. But we would tell you that if you're doing it with, certainly with commercial advertisers, and if you choose to do it with candidates, and you don't want the candidate to be on your website, then you have to come up with what would be a reasonable calculation of how much it would cost when you do buy directly from the website. And in cases where you're dealing with that kind of a package deal, you would have to take into consideration how much that website space was worth. But again, under no circumstances would you be directed by the FCC to put people on your website. There are a lot of broadcasters who have told us that one of the reasons they might not want to have people on the website is that it may give more of an appearance of some kind of affiliation between the station and the candidate.
Right.
And that's a little bit more logical to me than the idea of getting confused during the news programming. So the bottom line, you only have to consider what you do with the website and your commercial advertising world when you're dealing with candidates who you may not want on the website, and then you just have to evaluate or put a value on the time that you're giving as a bonus to the broadcast side.
Okay, so now we're going to jump into everybody's favorite topic, lowest unit charge or lowest unit rates. And boy, I think it's safe to say that this, of all the topics of political broadcasting, this is the one that we get the most calls, the most inquiries about, and obviously is front and center for many broadcasters out there that sell time. And so, for begin with, the lowest unit rate applies in all races, whether it's federal, state, or local. If you decide, you don't have to. If you decide you want to sell political time in a state election, once you make that decision, then the lowest unit rate provisions apply, the equal time provisions apply with lowest unit rate if this is occurring during the political windows. And what are those? So the lowest unit rate charges kick in 45 days before a primary or a caucus. And for Colorado, I guess you're gonna have a presidential primary on March 3rd, so it's kick in January 18th of 2020. You're going to have a primary on June 30th.
Right, for everything outside of presidential.
Correction, that's correct. For outside of presidential, the primary is on June 30th. So the window there would kick in on May 16th. And then it would also be 60 days before a general or a special election. So for the November 5th general election.
I think it's the 6th.
Well, it's this year, isn't it the 5th?
Oh, this year.
Yeah.
You're not talking about next year.
Right. Yeah. There are not major elections this year, but for the few elections that actually are happening in 2019.
Yeah.
I thought we'd give you that.
Just to be clear, I mean, in Colorado, because you are going to have this does not only apply with a presidential race. It's in any general election. So if you're having an election on November 5th, your lowest unit rate window is going to really open tomorrow, right? September 6th, isn't it tomorrow? Tomorrow's the 6th, right? So keep that in mind. For the November 3rd general, that's in 2020. We're going to be looking at September 4th of 2020 when the window opens. And bear in mind that the lowest unit rate charges, have to be in connection with a campaign. If you have a political candidate out there who owns a grocery store and he wants to buy commercials, ads for his grocery store, he can't ask for lowest unit rate charges for his grocery store, right? It has to be in connection with a campaign. The lowest unit charge has three components. It's the lowest unit rate charge for the same class and the same amount of time for the same period. that runs within that window. So it's not always easy to determine those three components, but let's try to drill down a little bit here. The same class, talking fixed versus preemptible versus ROS. Amount of time, that's fairly straightforward, 30 seconds, 60 seconds, what have you, whatever your slots are. And then period, again, prime time, drive time, whatever. Your lowest unit rate class is going to be, or is going to be defined by those three components so that you are comparing basically apples to apples and oranges to oranges. Within the 45-day primary window and the 60-day primary window, that's when the lowest unit rate charges kick in. And again, just taking a step back, you want to look at what the general objective here is on the part of the FCC, which is to offer that candidate the benefit of any discounts or any frequency discounts or the like that might otherwise be offered to your most favorable commercial advertiser. So the idea is that political candidate is not going to be discriminated against or receive anything less than the best deal that you are given to your commercial advertisers for the same class, the same amount of time, and the same period within those parameters.
You want to add something to what you just, what you're
Please do.
Yeah, and I add this because, and this may be one of the most important things that I say, and hopefully most of you are already aware of it, but just to make sure or to remind you, particularly now, but going back many, many years ago, there was an AM/FM combination station ownership, long before the days of anything beyond 7, 7, and 7, and then 12, 12, and 12, and now, hundreds and hundreds. But in the what we're seeing, and there's a substantial number of markets that have this, but where they have clusters of ownership, sometimes as many as 7 or 8 radio stations in a market. The sale of time, which sometimes the commercial advertisers may encompass their whole universe of stations in a market or in a region, to the extent that any of your stations participate in that kind of a transaction, group-owned situation, or even in sports networks, which are not group-owned, they're non-wired kind of networks, your individual stations do not need to consider what you get from those transactions in your lowest unit charge. So if somebody wants your lowest unit charge, absent those kinds of deals that are we'll call them a network variety, they're either clusters or you join a sports network or that kind of thing. All of that, which is, I'm assuming for many broadcasters has become quite common. Those you can put aside for your thinking about lowest unit charge. This notion of things being equal, apples to apples, is literal. It's literal. So if somebody has entered into a particular day part and they've done so through a long run of schedule, or they are doing a weekly rotation, and they end up in a particular program, whether it be drive time or prime time on occasion when they get lucky, if a candidate wants that particular discount privilege, they're going to need to buy either the run of schedule that led to the thing. They can't automatically get into a program because somebody got lucky in terms of the computerized or random selection of the placement of people in runs of schedule. And if they want the ability to get into certain programs on a weekly basis, then they will have to buy the rotations that may have led to what turns out to be the least expensive time in a particular program that rotates Monday through Friday.
Oh, good point. Excellent point. Thank you, Bobby. So let's try to maybe drill down on some examples here. So what would or would not be its own separate class, for example. So with package plans, package plans or bonus spots, as they may be considered, are not considered a separate class. The package plans are just are within the existing class, and are within that class are just considered to be a volume discount. Packages that maybe straddle multiple classes that already exist, those would just be allocated and divvied up between those various classes and or day parts. And then you would calculate the value for each of them, and then retain that information in a private file that you might have in the office. This is so that you want to have some backup on how you reached that calculation and how the package plan impacted the lowest unit charge, in case there's any inquiry from the FCC on that.
Can I just add something just to that particular
please,
point?
Absolutely. On all of this, please, Bobby, just jump in when you like.
On that last point about the maintenance of a private sort of non-public file, I can just tell you that, and it's not that you shouldn't do that, because I think it can come to your rescue if people are arguing that you've allocated things in a particular way that wouldn't be kosher. But in all the years since we came up with that idea, we've never asked any station to show us that particular file, despite getting complaints on occasion. And as I said in the very beginning, it would take a long way through a process for us to get to a point where we would look to the broadcaster to substantiate something that had happened like that. And so that doesn't mean don't do it, but it just.
Well, what if you had what if a candidate? What if another candidate? Because I've seen this situation where, you know, after elections, there's a whole little cottage industry of people filing complaints against broadcasters for violating lowest unit charge. I mean, would it not help you to have that?
Remarkably, and maybe it's a result of the informal approach that we take. We used to have tons of them, and we had one particular attorney, Bobby Kahn, who we still deal with on situations. But again, he like a lot of the other people that used to sort of just shoot things at us, they're interested in getting us to work things out for them, because for them, and now Bobby Kahn started his trade in this business by doing lowest unit charge complaints, and he had multitudes of them. And what he, in those days, and some of you maybe have been around long enough, but in the 90s, Bobby Kahn ultimately reasoned that he could go into court. So he could skip going to the FCC, and he would go into court arguing that these transactions were basically contractual. So if his research was indicating that maybe people hadn't been getting lowest unit charge, he went into court. He did it in 12 states, and he got judges to honor the fact that they could treat these as contractual arguments that had a rightful place outside the FCC. Well, in very short order, the commission wrote a preemption order which said to the world, including these courts, that no, you can't touch this stuff. This is ours. But we promised that we would handle lowest unit charge disputes in a kind of quasi-judicial way, which, in other words, we would allow for some discovery and do this and do that. And so we had in that particular episode, we had, I think, at least 75 formal complaints that were huge, and they were all in courts, and everybody was freaked out. I mean, certainly the broadcast industry was. And Bobby Kahn made a lot of money for his firm, not by getting resolution from us, but by going into the courts and causing all this chaos and so forth. He was very skillful at it, and ultimately most of the people that he was dealing with settled with him. And sometimes they settled if they had a pending settlement of a sale of a bunch of stations. They were very anxious to make it go away. And so that's what he did. But in any event, I'm not disputing the fact that we can get things that will drive us possibly to this kind of an inquiry. But they're very few and far between now, and I think maybe because mostly we just make things go away before they percolate into something too serious.
Thank you, Bobby. So package plans are not considered a separate class, but how about preemptible time? Well, preemptible time, that is stations that have separate levels of preemptible time, those can be treated as each a separate class, and each with its own lowest unit charge. So, stations should disclose the approximate likelihood of the preemption to the candidate so that they are aware of it. And then likewise, stations which sell just on a perpetual auction basis basically are considered to have one class of preemptible time. So what to include, just summarize in lowest unit charge. Clearly all paid spots, straight up paid spots. Within, you would include the value of packages and bonus spots. Consider all contracts that are in effect during that, pre-election window, whether it's the 45 days or the 60 days. Frequency discounts, and then likewise, special package plans should be considered as well. What not to consider. Spots where no payment is received, and I want to drop a little footnote here because it's interesting. We spoke a little earlier about uses, about having. We used the example of having say a DJ become a political candidate, and suddenly now why to pull him off the air. Among other things, is not only the equal time, but because he's on the air for free, right? He's an employee, he's on the air for free. So not only you would have to provide, other candidates equal time for the same amount, which in that case would be free. So keep that in mind as well. You can exclude barter spots, pre-inquiry spots. Also, if you offer bonus spots for charitable organizations or the like. And likewise, billboards or program sponsorships can also be excluded. Non-cash merchandising, promotional incentives can be excluded. But be sure to make it available to candidates on the same terms that you would to commercial advertisers, if that's the case, unless it's de minimis.
Or as Bobby was saying earlier, the FCC can't force you to give merchandise to a candidate,
right?
But you may have to calculate in your charge the value of that merchandise and deduct that from the lowest unit charge if you're not going to make these items available to that other candidate.
Right. And likewise, as Dan mentioned before, web services, can be excluded as well, or they can be treated as sort of a non-cash incentive. Lastly, charges for, say, production or line charges, those would not be rolled into the lowest unit rate charge either. So, make goods, how to handle those. A make good can affect your lowest unit charge. If the value of the make good is roughly about the same as the original buy, there should be no impact. But if the make good is lower than the other spots, then it could likewise lower your lowest unit charge. With audience information on audience shortfalls, make goods, that information may not be readily available. So you may have to do a workaround here, but make sure that your candidate is aware that this may not be available. You can try offering a cash rebate in that instance, or if the candidate has a stomach for future election campaigns, to give them a make good for subsequent elections. But
I guess the only place that's really going to probably come into play is a primary into a general. If the candidate has one, then that may be something they could reasonably be expected to accept. But
well, that's true. That's true. But also make sure that if you're making time-sensitive make goods available to commercial advertisers, you have to make the effort here to make political make goods run before an election, so as to give the candidate the benefit of that apples to apples comparison as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan to discuss some of the Campaign Reform Act legislation, and Dan, why don't you walk us through some of those requirements?
Sure. There's a requirement that basically affects whether or not a federal candidate is going to be entitled to the lowest unit charge. If they don't meet these certain certification requirements, then they will no longer qualify for the lowest unit charge for that election. Basically, what this requires is that the federal candidate has to certify that if the candidate's on-air material refers to an opponent, that this certain language has to be put in. We'll go over, basically it's sort of the language that you hear in many political ads, obviously because of this, where it says, you know, like, my name is Joe Smith, and I approved of this message, and, you know, that kind of language that has to be inserted into the announcement. This is if the candidate's on-air material refers to an opponent. You know, if the candidate is only talking about himself, then it does not necessarily need to be in here. It just has to be if you're talking about your opponent for a race. That is not to say that just the general sponsorship identification requirements will apply to all political ads. You know, that's not a BICRA requirement. That's just a general requirement. So, you know, whoever has actually paid for the ad does have to be identified, whether it's the candidate, his campaign committee, you know, a third party, that has to be in there. But this is an additional requirement on top of that. That will apply only to federal candidate ads that refer to the candidate's opponent. And then if the candidate does not certify to the station, both actually include this in their ad and certify to the station that it will be included in the ad, then you are entitled to deny the candidate the lowest unit charge for that purchase. Bobby, anything?
No?
Okay.
I'm speechless. I'm generally speechless when I see the word BICRA on there.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, it is convoluted. The next thing we'll talk briefly about is a political advertising disclosure statement. This is basically something that it's advisable that the station may want to have this in writing and provide it to candidates or agencies requesting time, either inside or outside the political windows. Basically what this does is this sort of sets out the station's policies, their classes of time. You know, it doesn't have to attach a rate to those classes. You know, you don't need to make lowest unit charge calculations and put them in this disclosure statement. But you can say, you know, these are the classes of time that we sell. These are the windows that we sell, things like that. So that any candidate or agency who's coming in to potentially buy time on the station has this information in front of them. You know, they don't actually have to read it. You just make it available to them. And it'll basically lay out the ground rules so that there is less question later on about whether the station is meeting its obligations. I will say that, you know, stations can do this with varying degrees of specificity. Obviously, the more specific you get in these disclosure statements, the more careful you have to be about monitoring whether anything in there is changing, and if it is, you know, changing your disclosure statement and updating it to reflect the reality. If it's a very generally written statement, then you may not have to update it as much. Here's just a few more comments about the things that you can put in the disclosure statement. Like I said, the classes of time that are available, preemptible, run of schedule, things like that. The lowest unit charge or comparable rate, you don't necessarily have to include that rate. Sometimes it's a good idea if you think that rate is going to be set. This is one of those places where, you know, the lowest unit charge can change drastically, you know, and pretty quickly. So, you could put a range in there and say that it will be made available, on request. Put in your make good policies, preemptible time practices, likelihood of preemption, sales practices, audience delivery, any sort of guarantees that you can make available. If you are actually going to make audience delivery promises and make goods, you put that in there. Any other practices, and then just sort of general policies. Charges, if a candidate wants to come and use your studio to record some kind of advertising, you want to put the charges that you'll impose for that, which, as we talked about before, will not go into the lowest unit charge. This is a separate charge that you can impose. Advanced payment policies, if you accept payment in various ways, how to make the payments. If a candidate is giving you an advertisement, how far in advance do you need to receive their ad copy? To run an ad on the weekend, do you need to get it by, say, Thursday night, or can you take it on Friday? That's the kind of thing that would go into this disclosure statement, so that you're on record of having informed them of these sort of ground rules for the advertising.
And Dan, although stations, which we'll talk about in a moment, are required to maintain political files in their public file, this statement does not have to go into the public file. Is that correct?
It does not have to. You can put it in there. That is a way to make it generally available to anybody. Obviously there are risks and costs and benefits to doing that. If you think there's somebody out there who's going to complain about what is in your statement, then maybe you don't put it in the political file. Also, if you have it in your political file, you're going to have to, anytime you change it, remember to go back into the political file and take down the old one, put in the new one, and make sure that it is always current. As I had said before, sponsorship identification, obviously this applies to all advertising, but it applies with even greater force to political advertising almost, simply because it's an area that people are watching very closely. And it's also an area where a lot of times it's hard to tell who has paid for a political advertisement or who the sponsor is. If you're seeing a general ad for Coca-Cola, it's pretty clear who paid for that. So you don't need to have a special ID in there. But for political advertising, it often is entirely unclear who has actually paid for the spot.
I could add that it's unclear even if you have a name of a sponsor.
True.
They use lots of euphemistic names. I won't mention any particular.
Right.
But there's lots of them. And it's certainly in this world now with the super PACs and the kinds of big money that are flowing into the issue advertisers' coffers. Things, at least at the federal level, have changed pretty dramatically. In the last presidential race, I believe, these numbers are pretty close, but Jeb Bush's super PAC, the one tagged to him, spent about 130 million, I think, and his own personal campaign committee, when he was running for the nomination, spent maybe 30 million. So, and that kind of example is not becoming too unusual. And it opens the door also to a lot of interesting techniques for advertising. There's not the reluctance to go negative. Sometimes they go negative pretty extremely. Candidates can say, well, I have nothing to do with it. I can't tell them what to do, and so on and so forth. And that's a it's like good cop, bad cop in a way. But it's interesting, but there's no regulation regarding these issue advertisers, even at the FCC, other than that they have to have sponsorship ID. Certainly shouldn't have any forbidden material in their ads, but they have no rights, no corresponding rights like candidates do.
Right.
There's no equal opportunities for these issue folks. Regrettably, I think you could, as broadcasters, you can choose to sell only to the Republican side of a particular election situation and refuse to sell to the Democratic side and vice versa. I don't think many broadcasters take advantage of that ability because, generally speaking, in most cases, about half your audience is one thing or the other, and they don't want to alienate. So And it's money, and if you can get money from both sides, it's more revenue to the station. That would be the likely, it seems to me, rationale for wanting to sell to everybody.
Makes sense.
Yeah, the one additional requirement here is that for candidate ads that are paid for by someone other than the candidate, not for an issue ad, but for one that is actually supporting a candidate, those have to say whether or not they are authorized by the candidate, regardless of who is paying for them. The other thing I would add here, and this is sort of an exception to the no censorship rule that we mentioned earlier. As a general rule, you as a station cannot change or censor in any way a candidate's advertisement. The one thing you can do is if they did not include a sponsorship ID in that ad, you can put that at the end or the beginning of the advertising.
Well, you typically, I think we tell people that you should offer the ability to reformat the ad and put the material in themselves, because it can, if the station does it, you always have the chance that it's going to impede some of the messaging that's on the screen. But if someone refuses to do it, they're not required to carry it unless there's an ID, so they can put it, you, the broadcasters, can put it on in your own production capabilities.
And as we had mentioned before, this is the additional BICRA requirement that applies only for federal candidates, which is that if the ad mentions the candidate's opponent, you have to add this certain language. On TV, it has to have an image of the candidate, have to identify themselves, say that they authorized the ad, and say that the candidate or his committee paid for the ad. There's some particular specifications that were on the previous slide about how much space this has to take up on the screen and how long it has to stay visible. On radio, it's similar, except obviously you don't need to have the image of the candidate, but it has to be the candidate's voice identifying themselves, the office that they're seeking, and that they approved the ad.
Can I just add something to this? To point out, BICRA, the reason I said before that it makes my mind go to turn to mush, just to give you an idea of one of the key requirements of BICRA, which is the stand by your ad kind of an idea, where you literally on television, in every ad, every single ad, there needs to be that image of the candidate. It needs to be at least 80% of the screen, so it's typically full screen, saying, "Hi, I'm Joe Blow, and I approve this message, and it's paid for by my committee." I'm not sure that even needs to be on there. So when you then know that every single television ad by a federal candidate has to have that, the notion that by then putting some language at the bottom of the ad at the end, that by the way, I approve this message and so forth because I've referred to my opponent, it's just silly. They take, the law requires literally total accountability, because you can see somebody, it's not like a little postage stamp picture like the other disclaimer on television is telling you to do if you've gone negative. So it's, what happened with BICRA is that the McCain and Feingold, in their desire to get this done, they tried so many times to get these kinds of regulations. They pushed it and used some techniques which included not going to conference. And when you don't go to conference, then people who have done different parts of a bill or have slightly different ideas, they get together and they resolve their differences and come up with a bill that usually it has much more legislative history than this one has, almost none. So we have these head scratchers, and we're left with trying to figure things out without any guidance. And you have situations like that one, which on their face are pretty ludicrous.
Great little bit of history there. Thank you, Bob. That's interesting. Fascinating.
And then there's sorry. The next slide is on additional BICRA sponsor identification requirements for programming that advocates the election or defeat of a federal candidate. And this does not have to be the candidate's own advertising. This can be third-party advertising that just advocates, for or against a candidate. It has to state whether it is authorized or not authorized by the candidate. Question over, who is actually enforcing this, whether it's the station's responsibility to do that or not. But obviously, you should be monitoring for this, and, if you notice that these things aren't in an ad that you're receiving, go back to the person who's placing the ad to try and get that added in. Now we'll go back over to Frank for a little bit on advance payment.
Okay, we're on the home stretch here because we want to keep this to 90 minutes with a little time for questions. So just the last few things just to kind of keep in mind. As far as type of payment, you can accept or not accept. For the federal candidates, you can require no more than payment 7 days in advance. For the state and local races, you should basically generally apply the policies that you apply for your commercial advertisers, so that it's equal and nobody feels sort of discriminated in that event. But again, remember that for the federal candidates, generally no more than 7 days in advance payment. With regard to credit, whether or not you're allowed to or have to provide credit to candidates, basically sort of three things to keep in mind. You have to provide credit if the candidate or the organization that you're dealing with has an established credit relationship with your station. If the candidate or the organization assumes responsibility for payment, so that you make sure you eventually get your money, and also that you would give credit in similar situations, again, to commercial advertisers as well. So if you satisfy those three, then you probably should offer credit to the candidate so as not to be accused of having discriminated against the candidate versus commercial advertisers. Political file. This is an important issue. This is a component of the online public inspection file that you have to maintain, and you will find out Colorado has a little while to go, but I'm sure are aware of the fact that the FCC has already started an FCC license renewal cycle. The radio stations in the Mid-Atlantic states, Virginia, the Carolinas, Maryland. Now we're going, next month it's going to be Florida and Puerto Rico, are all filing radio renewals, and next year it's going to be television renewals. And one of the things the FCC is really going to be doing a deep dive into is an online public inspection file. And again, part of that is the political file. So you want to make sure that within there you're maintaining the name of candidates requesting time, the details of who placed the order, relevant names, addresses, and contact information, as well as how the request was disposed of and how it was handled, what was sold, the schedule that was provided, the class of time, etc. Be able to summarize that information and maintain it in your online public inspection file. That's critical. I will separately do a plug that, as I mentioned at the beginning, our firm has a wide variety of webinars online on YouTube. There's Fletcher Hill has a YouTube page, and one of them is on the online public inspection file. So for a lot more detail on that, you can go into the YouTube page as well.
Can I just add something to that?
Absolutely.
I mean, this is only because we're seeing it now, or at least we're starting to understand it better. Since the advent of the digital FCC hosted file, which many people tell us that while they resisted the idea in the beginning, now like it because it's easier. They don't have people coming in, traipsing through their stations, looking at paper and so on and so forth. But something that I assume all of you, or at least most of you, are aware of this, but anything that you put into the file is time-stamped. It's a digital file, and we can see if we choose. But we don't, now, just to clarify before I say anything more about that, We do not monitor the files. It was one of the big worries I think the broadcast industry had when this idea came about, that, you know, we would sit and, you know, that I'm sure people's imagination had, you know, me and some of my cohorts looking at 20 different screens and, you know, trying to figure out who was good and who was not. It's not the case at all. It takes a complaint to drive our reviewing of any file. I've never looked at a single file unless it's in the context of what somebody is complaining about. But this time stamping has changed the ability of the FCC when we look at a file. It used to be that we had to rely on the representations that were being made to us, but we couldn't establish how many days it was late or whether it was months late and so on and so forth. And now we have that ability. So I would suggest to all of you that you, if you don't understand that you keep it in mind, because even if you end up having something in your file, in the old days, we wouldn't know whether it was late or it had been, you know, egregiously late. But now we'll know precisely the day that the material that was required was put into the file. And so that's just word to the wise.
No, very, very good advice. You're absolutely right. I mean, and that is something that, you know, people who are going through the renewals, you know, are well aware of the fact that it's not just, you know, what's in there, but when it was put in there, it's all sort of recorded, and so it becomes important.
And it's really, I mean, it's something to emphasize in the political file realm, because the political file, more than any of the other things that are required to be in your public file, is the one that is absolutely entirely time sensitive.
Right.
So that candidates who have 7 days to ask for equal opportunities, you know, and generally speaking, just for the universe of people who deal with politics, but also reporters and other people, to have snapshots of what's going on in a market. Just even a week late in the file could cause damage to a campaign, where if you're 2 weeks before an election and you don't get the paperwork in until 6 or 7 days before, or even sometimes 2 or 3 days, or not at all until after the election, that can be a legitimate problem. And that's one that I think that we do find interesting, because there's no question but that the lack of information in the file can be damaging.
Very good, absolutely. So just to wrap up some remaining points on the political file, again, you can maintain information about other non-exempt uses. This is information that should be kept in for 2 years, although once you go through a renewal cycle, a lot of it can be renewed and purged at that time. And we've already talked extensively about the use of the online public file as well. Dan, there are some additional political file requirements under BICRA, are they not?
Yes. Yeah, it's an additional requirement that, and this is one of the few requirements really that applies to issue advertising. Although it is, as you can see here, it's programming that communicates a political matter of national importance. So if you have, you know, a local issue about, you know, whether they should build a dog park, that's not going to qualify here. But if it's something, you know, if it's like climate change, that, you know, an issue of national importance, gun control, things like that, those are going to fall into this requirement. And also candidate, third-party ads for candidates or against candidates, that's also going to fall in here. What the BICRA requirement here is that you need to maintain a list of the officers and directors or the board of whatever entity it is that is sponsoring or purchasing that ad time. As Bobby was saying earlier, and as we've all seen, a ton of this third-party and issue advertising is paid for by these sort of nameless, these groups with these really vague names, you know, like People for America, or you know, People for Good Things, you know, that don't say anything and make it really hard to identify who who is really paying for this. And that's what this was supposed to get at. That there's the officers and directors need to be listed in something that goes into your public file. Obviously, even that may not provide a whole lot of useful information, because these entities can appoint, you know, whoever they want to as their officers, and those names may not be recognizable. But You have to ask for this, and it is supposed to go into your public file whenever that advertising airs.
All right, well, great, thanks, Dan. So I think we may have time for a few questions here before we get to the 90-minute mark here. Do we have any
I don't see
any questions? Any takers going once?
And obviously, I mean,
Right.
if you have questions after we are done, feel free, our contact
Absolutely.
information is there. And back on, I think it was this, we'll make the slides of this available. And back on the first or second, Bobby's and Gary's information at the FCC was on there as well.
Right.
So, you can reach out as you have questions.
Absolutely. Bobby, do you have any sort of last wrap-up things you'd like to sort of mention here that maybe we missed or might have covered?
No, I will say that, I had no control over it. Some of you may remember that back in January of 2017, we issued an order that was to clarify some of the ambiguities that are rampant in the BICRA law in terms of this particular issue, the last issue, the political matters of national importance. 10 days or so, we had it on the street about 10 days before the new president came in, and we were directed to rescind that order so that the people on the 8th floor, because we did it as a bureau, and then and the promise to the industry was that would happen pretty quickly, that they'd get it back on the street. Well, we're now 2 years later. There is a certain amount of promising movement in the building as we speak. And so I'm hopeful that before we get into the real heat of the primaries and so forth for the presidential and for all the other races that'll be in this incredible presidential election period that's coming up, I hope that we have it, to you guys sometime in September, but I certainly can't promise it. It is completely out of my control.
All right, thank you, Bobby. Well, with that, I guess we'll wrap things up. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today. Again, I'm Frank Montero from Fletcher, Hildreth. I want to thank my partner in crime here, Dan Kirkpatrick, who frequently we do these webinars together. I want to give a very special thanks to Bobby here for coming down and making himself available. Gary, wherever you are, we hope you feel better, and hope we can have you here next time. Just a couple of things. There's a lot of information on political broadcasting on comlawblog.com, some really great deep dive articles about these requirements. So feel free to tune into ComLaw and subscribe. It's for free to comlawblog.com to get additional information. I also need to give a shout out to Justin Sasso, the CEO of the Colorado Broadcasters, for helping to put this together. He does a phenomenal job. And of course, thanks to all the members and the board of directors of the Colorado Broadcasters for making this happen. Again, I'm Frank Montero. Pleasure, guys, have you here out there in Colorado. It's about your lunchtime, so enjoy your lunch. We'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.